Imagine the sound of wind rushing through a high mountain pass, a sound that has not changed in over 12,000 years. It is a dry, whistling breath that carries the scent of wild grasses and the faint, metallic tang of cold stone. In the high plateaus of what we now call southeastern Anatolia, the world is beginning to wake from a long, frozen slumber. For thousands of years, the earth had been gripped by the teeth of the great ice sheets, but now the air is softening. We find ourselves in a time of profound transition, a bridge between two worlds. Behind us lies the deep crystalline cold of the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, and before us lies a future no human has yet dared to imagine. This specific moment in the story of our planet is known to science as the Younger Dryas. It was a final, sharp snap of cold, a 1,000-year winter that briefly reclaimed the world just as it was beginning to warm. But as our story begins, that cold is finally, reluctantly, retreating. The landscape of the Fertile Crescent is a tapestry of silver-green hills and vast, undulating plains. Here, the ancestors of the wheat and barley that feed the modern world grow wild and untamed, swaying in the breeze like a golden sea. There are no fences here, no walls, no property. The people who move through this world are as fluid as the rivers that carve the valleys. They are hunter-gatherers, but the term feels too clinical for the reality of their lives. They are watchers. They are listeners. They move with the migrations of the gazelle and the ripening of the almond trees, living in a state of constant, intimate conversation with the land. These small bands of families possess a knowledge of the earth that we have long since forgotten. They know the exact moment a bulb is ready to be unearthed, and they can read the flight of a hawk like a map of the coming weather. Their homes are temporary, light things made of wood and hide, leaving little more than a circle of ash in the soil when they move on. To look at them from the perspective of our modern, frantic lives, one might assume their existence was a desperate struggle for survival, and yet the evidence suggests a life of relative abundance. In this warming world, the hills are teeming with life, and the rivers run thick with fish. There is time to think, time to dream, and time to wonder about the stars that wheel overhead in a sky untainted by the glow of a single artificial light. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, perhaps you can imagine yourself there, sitting by a small fire on a ridge overlooking the Karahan plain. The air is cool but pleasant, and the silence is so deep it feels like a physical presence. It is in this quietude that we find our purpose tonight. Here at the Slumber Archives, we believe that the echoes of the past are the perfect companion for a restful night. We bring you new journeys into the forgotten corners of history every single day, so if you find comfort in these stories, please do consider subscribing so we can meet here again tomorrow. A simple like on this video also helps our quiet community grow, allowing others to find their way to these peaceful shores. Now let us turn our gaze toward a specific limestone ridge, rising like the spine of a sleeping giant above the surrounding plains. To the local people of much later ages, this place would be known as Göbekli Tepe, the Hill of the Navel, or perhaps the Potbelly Hill. For thousands of years, it sat as a silent sentinel, a mound of earth and stone that seemed, to the casual observer, to be nothing more than a natural feature of the rugged landscape. But beneath the dust and the wild weeds lay a secret that would eventually challenge everything we thought we knew about the dawn of civilization. In the traditional story of human progress, we are told that we first learned to farm, that we settled into villages, domesticated animals, and only then, once our bellies were full and our settlements secure, did we find the time to build great temples and complex societies. We are taught that organized religion is a luxury of the settled mind, but Göbekli Tepe stands as a defiant, silent rebuttal to that timeline. It is a ghost from a time before the plough, a monument built by people who had not yet planted a single seed of grain or penned a single sheep. Imagine the sheer scale of the undertaking. 12,000 years ago, 6,000 years before the first stones were laid at Stonehenge, and 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza rose from the sands, these nomadic hunters began to gather at this specific ridge. They did not come to live here. There are no hearths, no trash heaps, no signs of daily domestic life. They came for something else, something that required them to move massive pillars of limestone, some weighing over 10 tons, from nearby quarries to the summit of the hill. Using nothing but stone tools, flint and obsidian, they carved these pillars into the shape of a capital letter T. They are stylized human forms, tall, slender, and imposing, with long arms reaching around to clasp their bellies. But they have no faces. They are anonymous giants, standing in concentric circles, staring inward toward a center that only they can see. The surfaces of these stones are not smooth. They are alive with high-relief carvings of the creatures that shared their world. Scorpions crawl across the limestone. Foxes leap, lions crouch with bared teeth, and vultures spread their wings in a grim, silent dance. How did a people, without a central government, without a written language, and without a permanent home, coordinate the labor of hundreds of individuals? How did they feed the workers who spent months, perhaps years, hewing these monoliths from the bedrock? The questions pile up like the earth that eventually covered the site, and the answers remain just out of reach, shrouded in the mists of deep time. Radiocarbon dating, the process of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to determine age, tells us with startling clarity that these structures belong to the 10th millennium before the Common Era. It is a date so remote that it feels almost mythical, and yet the stones are real. You can reach out and touch the tool marks left by a hand that has been dust for 120 centuries. As the years passed at Göbekli Tepe, the site grew. It was not built all at once, but in stages, layered one on top of the other. It seems that every few decades a circle would be used, and then, for reasons we may never truly understand, it would be deliberately buried. The people would haul baskets of earth and stone, filling the enclosure until the pillars were hidden from view, only to build a new, smaller circle directly on top of or beside the old one. It is as if the act of building was more important than the finished product. Or perhaps the burial was a ritual in itself, a way of laying the past to rest. The stratigraphy, the study of these layers of earth and debris, reveals a strange progression. Over the centuries, the circles became smaller, the pillars less grand, the carvings less intricate. It is a slow fading, a long lingering sunset of a culture that seemed to lose its creative fire even as it moved closer to the discovery of agriculture. By the time the site was finally abandoned and lost to the memory of man around 8,000 years before the Common Era, the great monumental enclosures were a thing of the past. But we must ask ourselves, what was the spark? What drove these people to abandon their nomadic wandering for a time and gather on this lonely hill? Was it a fear of the changing climate? A need to appease spirits they believed controlled the returning warmth? Or was it something more profound, the birth of the human ego, the first time we looked at the natural world and decided to leave a permanent mark upon it? As we dwell on these ancient mysteries, the mind begins to wander through the long corridors of the forgotten. We see the flicking shadows of torchlight against the limestone pillars. We hear the rhythmic chipping of flint against stone, and we feel the immense weight of the ages pressing down. The world of 12,000 years ago was a place of shadows and giants, a world where the line between the human and the divine was as thin as the morning mist over the Euphrates. The first temple is a silent witness to a story we are only just beginning to learn how to read. It tells us that we have always been dreamers, that even when we were few and the world was vast and terrifying, we sought to build something that would last, something that would stand against the wind and the rain and the slow, inevitable march of the centuries. And so, as the stars continue their slow journey across the velvet sky, we leave the hill of Göbekli Tepe to its long, stony sleep, knowing that the greatest mysteries are often those that lie right beneath our feet, waiting for the right moment to be found. The smell of sun-drenched dust and wild thyme hangs heavy in the air of southeastern Turkey, a scent that has likely remained unchanged for thousands of seasons. In the autumn of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt found himself walking the gentle slopes of a limestone plateau, guided by reports of a site the locals called Göbekli Tepe, or Potbelly Hill. It was a lonely place, a rounded mound rising some 50 feet above the surrounding landscape, appearing at first glance to be little more than a natural feature of the rolling terrain. But as Schmidt's boots crunched over the parched earth, he noticed something that disturbed the natural order of the soil. The ground was not merely dirt and stone, it was shimmering with the dark, glassy light of flint. Thousands upon thousands of flint flakes lay scattered across the surface, so densely packed that they crunched like gravel underfoot. To a trained eye, these were not random stones. They were the debris of an ancient industry, blades, scrapers and points, all fashioned by human hands. Schmidt knelt in the heat, running his fingers through the sharp fragments, realizing that he was standing on the site of a monumental undertaking. Decades earlier, in the 1960s, researchers from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University had visited this same hill. They had seen the mounds of stone and the curious limestone slabs poking through the earth, but they had dismissed them, categorizing the site as a medieval cemetery. They assumed the carved stones were gravestones, perhaps a few centuries old, and that the flint tools were merely surface scatter from a minor prehistoric camp. They had looked at the very same hill and seen nothing out of the ordinary, and so the secret of the mound remained buried for another 30 years. But Klaus Schmidt felt a different pull, a quiet intuition that the scale of the flint scatter pointed towards something far more profound than a simple graveyard. He looked at the way the mound was shaped, noting that it was not a natural hill at all, but an artificial one, a tell, created by layers upon layers of human activity. As he walked toward the summit, he encountered a massive rectangular block of limestone, its edges worn smooth by the wind, barely cresting the surface of the soil. It didn't look like a headstone. It looked like the top of a giant. He recognized the shape from his work at Menagerie, a nearby site that was already considered ancient, but this felt older, larger, and far more silent. The mystery of the hill began to unravel the following year, when the first true excavations commenced. Schmidt and his team did not find the shallow graves of medieval farmers. Instead, as they carefully brushed away the tightly packed sediment, they revealed the tops of enormous T-shaped pillars, carved from a single piece of limestone. These were not small markers, they were megaliths, some standing nearly 20 feet tall and weighing many tons. As the earth was slowly removed, inch by agonizing inch, the team realized that these pillars were arranged in perfect circles, their flat tops reaching upward as if to support a roof that had long since vanished into the ether of time. The realization was staggering. The sheer size of the stones suggested a level of social organization and technical skill that was supposed to be impossible for the people of that era. According to the standard timeline of human history, the inhabitants of this region 12,000 years ago were simple hunter-gatherers. They were nomads who followed the migrations of gazelle and gathered wild grasses, living in small, flexible bands. They were not supposed to have architects. They were not supposed to have stonemasons. They were certainly not supposed to have the means to quarry, transport, and upright stones that weighed as much as several elephants. As the dust settled in the excavation trenches, the team began to use radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material found within the soil layers. The results were not just surprising, they were revolutionary. The lowest levels of the site, the oldest structures, dated back to the 10th millennium before the Common Era. This placed the construction of Göbekli Tepe at the very end of the last ice age, during a period known as the Younger Dryas, a time when the world was shivering through a sudden, 1,000-year return to glacial cold. To put this vast stretch of time into perspective, these stone circles were already 6,000 years old when the first stones were laid at Stonehenge. They were older than the Great Pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. They were built before the invention of the wheel, before the discovery of metallurgy, and most importantly, before the invention of agriculture. This was the most troubling revelation of all. The conventional wisdom of archaeology had always maintained that humans first settled down in villages to farm, and only once they had a surplus of food and a stable home did they begin to build temples and complex societies. But at Göbekli Tepe there were no signs of permanent houses. There were no hearths, no trash heaps filled with domestic waste, and no evidence of domesticated grain. Instead, the fills surrounding the pillars were packed with the bones of wild animals, gazelle, aurochs, and wild boar. It appeared that the people who built this place were still hunters, still wandering the vast Anatolian plains, and yet they had come together to move mountains. Schmidt began to suspect that he had found the world's first temple, a place of pilgrimage where scattered tribes converged for reasons that were not practical, but spiritual. It was as if the temple had come before the city, as if the need to worship, the need to connect with the divine or the ancestors, was the very thing that forced humanity to settle down and change the way we lived forever. As the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows from the T-shaped pillars, the sight took on an even more haunting quality. The pillars were not just blank stones, they were covered in high-relief carvings of predators and protectors. Scorpions, lions, foxes, and vultures shimmered in the twilight, frozen in stone for 100 centuries. The craftsmanship was delicate, almost fluid, showing a deep, intimate knowledge of the natural world. These were not the crude scratchings of a primitive mind, they were the works of masters. Walking through the trenches, one could almost feel the presence of the thousands of people who must have laboured here. You can imagine the rhythmic sound of stone hitting stone, the chanting of songs to keep pace, and the smell of roasting meat from the great feasts that likely accompanied the work. The hill was a hive of activity, a beacon in a wild world. But why here? Why this specific limestone ridge? And why, after centuries of use, did they eventually choose to bury the entire complex under thousands of tons of clean earth, preserving it in a giant, man-made time capsule for us to find 12,000 years later? The stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth, told a story of deliberate concealment. The site hadn't been abandoned and left to crumble, it had been carefully put to sleep. Each circle was filled in with debris, stone chips, and soil, creating the very mound that Klaus Schmidt had first walked upon. It was an act of monumental effort, almost as great as the construction itself. Perhaps they were protecting it, or perhaps they were finished with it, closing a chapter of their history that we are only just beginning to read. As the night air cools and the first stars emerge over the Anatolian plateau, the silence of Göbekli Tepe feels heavy with the weight of these forgotten ages. The massive pillars stand in their dark pits, their T-shaped silhouettes resembling stylized human forms with long arms reaching around to their bellies as if holding a secret close to their hearts. They have watched the rise and fall of every civilization we have ever known. They stood in the dark while the first cities of Mesopotamia were built. They remained buried while the Roman Empire expanded and collapsed. They slept through the Industrial Revolution and the birth of the modern world. And now they are waking up, challenging everything we thought we knew about the dawn of human culture. The mystery of Potbelly Hill is not just a question of who built it or how, but why the human spirit so long ago felt the need to leave such a profound mark upon the earth. In the quiet of the excavation, under the watchful eyes of the stone foxes and vultures, we are reminded that our ancestors were not so different from us. They felt the same wonder at the night sky, the same fear of the dark, and the same inexplicable urge to build something beautiful, something eternal, in a world that is always changing. And so, the stones remain, patient and still, waiting for us to listen to the story they have been holding for 12,000 years. To touch the surface of the stones at Göbekli Tepe is to press one's palm against the very skin of the past, a cold, textured interface between our world and a time so distant it defies the reach of memory. As we move deeper into the heart of the site, we find ourselves standing within the circular enclosures, those strange and silent rings that seem to pulse with a slow, rhythmic energy. These are not merely walls. They are boundaries drawn in the dust of the Anatolian plateau, separating the mundane world from a space that was clearly intended to be sacred. The enclosures are vast, some reaching 20 meters across, their perimeters defined by smaller T-shaped pillars that stand like sentinels, shoulder to shoulder, linked by walls of stacked stone. But it is the centers of these circles that command our breath to still. There, rising out of the bedrock, stand the twin central pillars, two monolithic giants that dwarf everything around them, reaching toward the open sky as if trying to bridge the gap between the earth and the heavens. The sheer scale of these central pillars is a quiet defiance of everything we thought we knew about the people of the early Holocene. Each one can weigh as much as 20 tons, carved from a single block of limestone, with a precision that suggests a deep, intimate knowledge of the medium. We must pause here to consider the physical reality of this achievement, a reality that existed 11,600 years ago. In an era long before the invention of the wheel, long before the domestication of the horse or the ox, and thousands of years before the first bronze chisel would be forged, these people were moving mountains. They were not merely surviving, they were engineering. To move a 20-ton monolith from a quarry to its final resting place requires more than just strength. It requires a sophisticated understanding of friction, leverage, and collective coordination that we are only beginning to grasp. The limestone plateau itself served as both the canvas and the source. This geological formation, a hard and resilient cradle of stone, provided the raw material for the temple's birth. When we look closely at the surrounding landscape, we can still see the ghosts of the pillars that were never raised, the negative spaces in the bedrock where blocks were partially carved and then abandoned for reasons we may never understand. The quarrying process was an act of immense patience. Using only tools of harder stone such as flint and obsidian, the builders would peck away at the limestone for months, perhaps years, slowly isolating the massive shapes from the living rock. There is a profound stillness in the thought of a craftsman sitting in the heat of the afternoon, the rhythmic sound of stone striking stone echoing across the hills, 1,000 tiny strikes eventually giving birth to a monument that would outlast his lineage by 100 generations. Once freed from the earth, these giants had to be transported across the uneven terrain. Without beasts of burden to pull them or wheels to roll them, the builders likely relied on wooden rollers and massive systems of ropes made from plant fibers. It is a vision of human cooperation that borders on the miraculous. Hundreds of individuals, their muscles straining in unison, guided by the steady beat of a drum or a shared chant, inching the stone forward through the dust. Every foot gained was a victory of the collective will over the laws of physics. And when the pillars finally reached the enclosures, they were not simply dropped into place. They were slotted into pedestals carved directly into the bedrock with such accuracy that they have remained standing through earthquakes and the slow grind of millennia until the day they were finally unearthed by the modern world. The walls that connect the outer pillars are equally mesmerizing in their quiet complexity. This is dry stone walling at its most primordial, a technique where stones are fitted together without the use of mortar or clay to hold them in place. The builders selected and shaped each stone so carefully that gravity itself becomes the glue, the weight of the upper layers pressing down to create a structure that is both flexible and incredibly strong. There is a tactile beauty in these walls, a mosaic of rough-hewn shapes that creates a play of light and shadow as the sun moves across the site. They are not the straight, clinical lines of modern architecture, but rather organic curves that seem to grow out of the earth, following the natural contours of the hills and the intuitive demands of the space. As we trace the lines of the masonry, we begin to notice the precision of the carvings that decorate the pillars. These are not crude scratches, but high-relief sculptures that leap out from the stone. Foxes with bushy tails, snarling predators, and long-legged birds are rendered with a startling realism that suggests the builders were keen observers of the natural world. But it is the pillars themselves that hold the most mystery. Many of them feature stylized arms carved along their sides, with hands meeting over a belt at the front. They are anthropomorphic. They are stone people, frozen in an eternal gesture of stillness. They have no faces, no eyes to meet our gaze, as if their identity was something too vast or too sacred to be captured in a human likeness. They stand in their circles, facing one another in a silent dialogue that has lasted for 12,000 years, witnesses to a time when the world was fresh and the boundaries between the human and the divine were still being drawn. The technical mastery required to create such a site during the transition from the last ice age is a puzzle that challenges our understanding of human progress. We often think of history as a straight line, a steady climb from primitive beginnings to modern complexity, but Göbekli Tepe suggests a different story, a story of sudden, brilliant flourishes of genius that can emerge and then vanish into the mists of time. These builders were not primitive in any sense that matters. They possessed a sophisticated grasp of geometry and a deep understanding of the structural properties of limestone. They knew how to work with the grain of the stone, how to prevent it from cracking under its own immense weight, and how to create a sense of monumental scale that still humbles us today. As the wind whispers through the empty enclosures, we are forced to confront the limits of our knowledge. We see the how of the architecture, the quarrying marks, the lever points, the dry stone techniques, but the why remains just out of reach, shimmering like a mirage on the horizon. Why did a group of hunter-gatherers, people who lived in a world of constant movement, decide to anchor themselves to this specific hill? Why did they invest such an incredible amount of energy and time into moving these 20-ton stones? The effort required to build just one of these enclosures is estimated to have taken hundreds of people working for several months, a feat of organization that implies a complex social structure we previously thought impossible for this period. The stones do not give up their secrets easily. They sit in the sun, warming slowly through the day and radiating heat long after the stars have appeared. They are heavy with the weight of deep time, a concept that is difficult for the human mind to truly grasp. To think of 12,000 years is to think of a span of time so vast that empires have risen and fallen, languages have been born and forgotten, and even the stars in the night sky have shifted their positions. And yet, the precision of the dry stone walling remains. The pillars still stand, their silent hands still resting on their stone belts. We are looking at the very first instance of monumental architecture, the moment when humanity decided to leave a permanent mark upon the face of the earth, a stone thumbprint that would endure long after their names were lost to the wind. In the presence of these impossible structures, we feel a sense of profound connection to those distant ancestors. We share their struggle against the elements, their desire to create something that lasts, and their fascination with the massive and the enduring. The architecture of Göbekli Tepe is a testament to the fact that the human spirit has always been capable of the extraordinary, even in the absence of the tools we now consider essential. It is a reminder that our history is much longer and much more complex than we ever dared to imagine. A story written in stone, waiting in the quiet of the Anatolian hills for us to find the key to its silent language. Under the vast, starlit sky, the enclosures remain as they have always been, cold, patient, and magnificent in their mystery. As we turn our gaze from the towering silhouettes of the pillars themselves to the skin of the stone, a hidden world begins to emerge from the limestone surface. It is a silent menagerie, a frozen procession of life that has remained motionless for 120 centuries. To run one's hand, metaphorically, across these surfaces is to feel the heartbeat of a world that no longer exists, a time when the boundary between the human soul and the wild breath of the forest was thin, perhaps even non-existent. The craftsmanship displayed here is not the crude scratching of a primitive mind, but the deliberate, sophisticated work of masters. They did not merely etch lines into the rock, they practiced the difficult art of high relief. They carved away the background, centimetre by painstaking centimetre, until the animals seemed to leap out from the pillar, three-dimensional and pulsing with a strange static energy. One might wonder how many thousands of hours were spent under the glare of the prehistoric sun, with nothing but flint tools and patient hands, to coax a stone fox from its mineral sleep. The fox is a recurring ghost in these enclosures. It is depicted with a sharp muzzle and a bushy tail, often portrayed in a state of tension, as if it is about to bolt into the tall grasses of the pre-pottery Neolithic landscape. There is a lean, predatory grace to these carvings that suggests the artists were not drawing from memory alone, but from a deep, intimate observation of the living creature. And yet, the fox is joined by far more unsettling companions. Scorpions, with their segmented tails arched in a perpetual threat, crawl across the stone. Spiders and serpents wind their way through the geometry of the pillars, their presence a reminder of the stinging, biting realities of the ancient wild. It is a curious thing to build a temple and fill it with the imagery of the dangerous. In our modern world, we often surround ourselves with the soft and the domestic, but for the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the sacred seems to have been synonymous with the untamed. There are no sheep here, there are no goats, no cattle, no dogs, and no pigs. The animals that would later become the backbone of human civilization, the creatures we invited into our fences and our homes, are nowhere to be found in this lithic gallery. This absence speaks volumes across the gulf of time. It tells us that when these stones were raised, the concept of ownership over nature had not yet taken root in the human psyche. The world was still a place of wild encounters, a realm where humans were but one thread in a vast and lethal tapestry. Instead of the docile, we find the vulture. These birds are carved with their great wings spread wide, their necks curved in a way that suggests both majesty and a grim preoccupation with the transition between life and death. In many ancient cultures, the vulture was seen as a psychopomp, a guide for the soul, a creature that consumed the earthly remains to carry the spirit into the sky. As we look upon these stone raptors, we are forced to consider if the pillars were not just supports for a roof, but markers for a gateway, a place where the living came to negotiate with the forces of the end. The level of anatomical detail is startling. The tilt of a head, the musculature of a predatory cat, the bristling fur of a boar. These are not symbols of food, for the bones found in the refuse heaps nearby tell a different story of what these people ate. These carvings are something else entirely. They are perhaps the first recorded language of the spirit, a way of mapping the terrors and wonders of a world that was still very much in control of its human inhabitants. As the light shifts across the enclosures, the shadows play within the deep recesses of the carvings, making the stone animals seem to breathe. A boar charges forever into a void. A crane stands in elegant, long-legged silence. A malevolent-looking reptile slithers downward toward the earth. The sheer labor required to produce such high-relief work implies a society that valued the image as much as the structure. It suggests a culture that had moved beyond the simple struggle for survival and into a space where art was a communal necessity, a way of anchoring their stories to the very bones of the earth. We must ask ourselves what it meant to stand in the center of such a circle 12,000 years ago. Surrounded by these towering pillars, one would be encircled by a ring of predators and scavengers, a stone forest of teeth, talons, and stingers. It is a far cry from the peaceful imagery we might expect from a place of worship. It feels more like a confrontation, a deliberate gathering of the most potent forces of the natural world into a single, concentrated point. The mystery deepens when we consider the technical skill involved. To create high relief, the artist must envision the finished form within the block and remove everything that is not the animal. It requires a spatial intelligence and a steady hand that challenges our assumptions about the primitive nature of hunter-gatherers. These were people who understood the grain of the stone, the limits of their flint blades, and the enduring power of the visual form. And so, the menagerie stands guard, as it has for millennia. The foxes remain alert, the vultures remain patient, and the scorpions remain poised. They are the silent witnesses to a time when humanity was first beginning to dream in stone, carving its fears and its awe into the landscape before the first seeds were ever planted in the soil. In the stillness of the Anatolian night, one can almost hear the rustle of stone wings and the soft tread of limestone paws, a reminder that though the builders are long gone, their visions remain, etched in the enduring silence of the rock, waiting for a world that has forgotten how to speak their language. As we move deeper into the enclosures, we realize that the animals are not just decorations. They are the inhabitants of this space, the primary residents of a sanctuary that was built not for the comfort of man, but for the honor of the wild. The mastery of the carving, the choice of the subjects, and the lack of any domestic presence all point toward a mindset that is profoundly alien to our own, a way of being in the world that saw no distinction between the physical and the metaphysical, between the hunter and the hunted. The weight of these ages presses down upon the sight, a thick layer of time that we are only just beginning to peel back. Each carved feather and each stony claw is a clue, a fragment of a lost cosmology that once explained the rising of the sun and the turning of the seasons. In this place, the animals are the masters, and the stone is the medium through which they speak of a world that was raw, beautiful, and terrifyingly alive. We are left to wander through their shadows, marveling at the hands that shaped them and the minds that saw, in a block of cold limestone, the hidden spirit of a leaping fox. If you look closely at the central monoliths, past the snarling predators and the intricate relief of the birds, a new shape begins to emerge from the limestone, a shape that feels strangely familiar, yet profoundly alien. These towering T-shaped pillars are not merely structural supports, nor are they abstract totems. when the light of a flickering torch or the low golden rays of a winter solstice sun hit the stone at just the right angle, the pillars reveal themselves to be something more. They are stylized, anthropomorphic beings, giants made of rock who have stood in silent vigil for 12,000 years. Archaeologists have spent decades tracing the subtle lines carved into the sides of these central giants, and what they found changed our understanding of the Neolithic mind. On the narrow edges of the pillars, there are long, slender arms carved in low relief, reaching down from the horizontal capstone, which we might now recognize as a head, toward the midsection of the stone. The fingers are long and delicate, meeting just above a carefully rendered belt. Below these hands, we see the depiction of a loincloth made of animal skin, draped over the waist of the pillar. It is a moment of profound recognition, the realization that these massive stones were intended to represent the human form, or perhaps a form that transcends the human into the realm of the divine. Yet for all the detail present in the hands and the garments, there is a striking, perhaps even haunting, omission. These beings have no faces. The T-shaped heads are smooth, flat, and featureless, devoid of eyes to see, mouths to speak, or ears to listen. In the silence of the temple, this lack of a face suggests a level of abstraction that is remarkably sophisticated for a people living 10 millennia before the dawn of the Bronze Age. Perhaps, to the builders of Göbekli Tepe, these deities or ancestors were too powerful to be given a human countenance. Or perhaps their identity was so well understood by the community that a face was simply unnecessary. They represent a bridge between our world and the unknown, beings who possess the stature of a person, but the permanence and scale of a mountain. As we contemplate these faceless giants, we begin to see a complex hierarchy emerging between the human figure and the animal world that surrounds it. In later civilizations, we often see humans dominating nature, but here, in the cradle of the Stone Age, the relationship is more nuanced, more mysterious. The animals are often depicted on the bodies of these stone beings, as if they are guardians, or perhaps even the spiritual essence of the figure itself. A fox might be tucked under an arm, a snake might wind its way toward the belt. There is no sense of conflict here, but rather a deep, interconnected tapestry of life. The humans are larger than the animals, yes, but they are also part of the same stone, carved from the same bedrock, bound together in a single eternal moment. This brings us to a quiet realization about the nature of early religion. Before the invention of writing, before the rise of kings, and long before the first seeds were ever planted in the soil of the Fertile Crescent, these people were already grappling with the concept of the soul and the structure of the cosmos. They were using the human body as a map to understand the universe, a vessel for the divine that stood tall amidst a world of wild beasts. The pillars do not look out at us. They look toward each other, arranged in a circle that suggests a conversation we are no longer invited to hear. In this space, the boundary between the hunter and the hunted seems to dissolve. The stone beings wear the skins of animals, yet they stand with the upright dignity of a priest or a leader. They are the masters of the wild, and yet they are silent participants in its rhythms. As the wind whistles through the open enclosures of the tepe, one can almost feel the presence of these others, these stone watchers who have seen the stars shift their positions over thousands of years, watching as the world of the hunter-gatherer slowly faded into the world of the farmer. We are left to wonder if these pillars were meant to be portraits of specific ancestors, or if they were the first true gods, the great ones who commanded the rains and the migrations of the gazelle. In the absence of a face, we are invited to project our own questions onto the stone. We see the curve of a shoulder, the strength of a wrist, and the heavy weight of the capstone head, and we feel a kinship that spans the vast gulf of deep time. It is a reminder that even 12,000 years ago, the human spirit was already reaching for something larger than itself, carving its own likeness into the very bones of the earth, and surrounding that likeness with the spirits of the wild, creating a sanctuary where the human and the divine could finally meet in the stillness of the afternoon. A single sharp fragment of flint rests in the palm of a modern hand, its edges still keen enough to draw blood despite 12 millennia of silence. This small tool, discarded in the limestone dust, tells a story that contradicts almost everything we once believed about the birth of civilization. For generations, the story of humanity followed a predictable, comfortable rhythm. We were told that first we learned to plant seeds, then we built permanent homes to watch over our harvests, and only after our bellies were full and our roofs were secure did we find the leisure to build temples and invent gods. We assumed that hunger was the primary architect of the world, yet as the dust is brushed away from the floors of Göbekli Tepe, a different truth begins to emerge. A truth that suggests the soul was hungry long before the body sought the security of the granary. When we look closely at the debris left behind by the builders, we do not find the charred remains of domesticated wheat or the bones of penned-in sheep. Instead, the ground is a vast graveyard of the wild. There are tens of thousands of bone fragments scattered throughout the fill, the remains of massive aurochs with horns like crescent moons, the delicate limbs of gazelles that once thundered across the Harran plains in their thousands, and the skeletons of wild boar and red deer. These were not the animals of a farm, but the quarry of the deep forest and the open steppe. The people who gathered here were hunters, moving with the seasons and the migrations, living in a world that was still untamed and fiercely alive. They were eating the bounty of the wilderness, roasting enormous quantities of meat over open fires to feed the thousands of laborers required to haul the great T-shaped pillars from the nearby quarries. As the years passed and the excavations deepened, archaeologists realized something even more startling. Among the towering stone circles and the intricate carvings of predators, there is a profound absence. There are no hearths for daily cooking, no sleeping platforms, and no domestic trash heaps that would characterize a village. There are no private spaces where a family might retreat from the world. During its peak, Göbekli Tepe was not a city of the living, but a cathedral in the wild. It was a place of pilgrimage, a destination that drew people from hundreds of miles away, crossing rugged mountains and vast river valleys to participate in something that transcended the simple act of survival. They did not live here. They came here to be part of a story. This absence of housing challenges the very foundation of the Neolithic Revolution, that great turning point in human history when we supposedly traded the wandering life for the sedentary one. The traditional timeline suggests that agriculture was the engine of change, the spark that ignited the transition to complex society. But at Göbekli Tepe, the sequence is reversed. The temple comes first. The monumental architecture, the organized labor, and the shared symbolic language all appear while the people are still living as foragers. It suggests that it was not a change in our diet that transformed us, but a change in our minds. Perhaps it was a new religious vision, or a collective need to map the cosmos in stone that forced our ancestors to organize on a scale never before seen. To feed the people building the temple, they eventually had to find more reliable ways to gather food. And so, the long, slow process of domesticating wild grasses began as a consequence of the temple, rather than its cause. The hillsides surrounding the site are still home to the genetic ancestors of einkorn wheat, the very grain that would eventually sustain the great civilizations of Mesopotamia. It is a haunting thought to imagine a group of hunters, sitting in the shadow of a newly raised pillar, perhaps resting their weary limbs after a day of hauling limestone, while idly tossing handfuls of wild seeds into the disturbed earth. They could not have known that this simple act, repeated over centuries to sustain their sacred work, would eventually end their way of life forever. They were standing at the edge of a threshold, between the old world of the forest and the new world of the field, and they were led across that line by their devotion to the unseen. The stratigraphy, the layers of earth and time that archaeologists peel back like the pages of a book, reveals a period of intense activity during a time known as the Younger Dryas. This was a 1,000-year snap of bitter cold and drought that gripped the world just as the last ice age seemed to be ending. In a landscape that was becoming harsher and more unpredictable, the people did not scatter. Instead, they huddled together and built something magnificent. They clung to their rituals with a newfound intensity. It is as if the cooling of the earth forced a flowering of the human spirit, a desperate, beautiful attempt to find order in a climate that had turned chaotic. We often think of the people of 12,000 years ago as primitive, perhaps even simple, because they lacked the technologies we take for granted. But as we walk through the silent circles of Göbekli Tepe, we see a sophistication of thought that is almost overwhelming. To coordinate the movement of a 10-ton block of stone without the wheel or beasts of burden requires a level of social cohesion and shared purpose that we struggle to achieve today. It requires a common belief, a mythology so powerful that it can bridge the gap between different tribes and wandering bands. They were united by the stone, by the carvings of the vultures and the foxes, and by the shared experience of watching the stars move between the pillars. The mystery of this place lies in the silence of the transition. We can see the bones of the animals they ate and the tools they used, but we cannot hear the songs they sang or the prayers they whispered to the pillars. We are left to wonder why religion became the catalyst for the greatest shift in human history. Why did we choose to settle down? Was it truly for the security of a harvest? Or was it because we had found a place so sacred that we could no longer bear to leave it? The evidence at Göbekli Tepe whispers that we are, at our core, a symbolic species. We do not live by bread alone. We live by the meanings we carve into the world around us. And so, the image of the lone hunter-gatherer wandering the landscape in a state of constant struggle begins to fade. In its place, we see a people capable of immense vision and artistic grace. They were masters of their environment, knowing the exact moment the wild grasses would ripen and the precise path the gazelle would take through the valley. They lived in a world of abundance, not scarcity, and they used that abundance to honor something they perceived in the sky or in the shadows of the limestone caves. The revolution was not a sudden discovery of a new seed. It was the slow, deliberate construction of a new way of being. As the wind moans through the empty sockets of the pillars, we are reminded of the fragility of our own understanding. Our theories are like the fill that eventually buried these circles, layers of interpretation that accumulate over the centuries, sometimes obscuring the very thing they mean to protect. The radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to pinpoint an object's age, tells us that these stones were standing long before the pyramids, long before Stonehenge, and long before the first city walls were ever raised. They represent a lost epoch, a time when the boundaries between the human, the animal, and the divine were still fluid and permeable. In this world before farming, the temple was the center of the universe. It was the anchor that held the people to the land, even as they moved across it. It was the laboratory where the first experiments in social organization and large-scale cooperation were conducted. And as we sit in the stillness of our own time, looking back across the 12,000-year divide, we realize that we are still living in the shadow of those pillars. The world we have built, our cities, our farms, our nations, all began here, in a place where no one lived, but where everyone came to wonder. The first seeds were not planted in the earth, but in the human imagination, watered by the rituals of a people who saw the sacred in the curve of a stone and the flight of a bird. The hunter eventually became the farmer, but only because the dreamer had first become a builder. The scent of roasted meat on the wind is a memory that travels across 12 millennia, a savory, heavy aroma that would have drifted for miles across the high plateaus of what we now call Anatolia. It was a signal, a silent call to those wandering the vast distances of the Fertile Crescent, telling them that the time for isolation had ended and the time for the gathering had begun. Imagine, if you will, the horizon dotted with small moving silhouettes, tiny bands of hunters and foragers emerging from the valleys and the scrublands, all drawn by a common thread of purpose toward the limestone ridge of Göbekli Tepe. These were people who lived in a world without borders, without kings, and without permanent homes. Yet they were moving toward a singular point in the landscape with the precision of a modern pilgrimage. This was not a city, and no one slept within its stone circles for more than a few nights at a time. Instead, it functioned as a regional ritual center, a sacred neutral ground where the scattered tribes of the upper Mesopotamia could set aside the struggle for survival and enter the realm of the eternal. The sheer scale of the labor required to carve and move these multi-ton pillars suggests a social organization far more sophisticated than we once thought possible for hunter-gatherers. To quarry a piece of limestone the size of a modern truck, using only tools of flint and wood, to drag it up a slope and set it upright in a perfectly circular pit, requires more than just muscle. It requires a shared vision, a hierarchy of architects and laborers, and a way to feed hundreds of people who are no longer spending their days hunting for their own families. Archaeologists have found the silent remains of this massive effort in the form of thousands of animal bones, gazelle, wild cattle and deer, piled in the fill between the enclosures. These are not the remains of daily meals, but the debris of gargantuan feasts, ancient celebrations where hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people sat together under the stars to consume the bounty of the wild. This feasting served as the social glue that held the project together, a way to turn a grueling task into a communal celebration, ensuring that the different bands would return year after year to continue the work of their ancestors. As the meat sizzled over great communal fires, a different kind of exchange was taking place, an invisible commerce of the mind. In the flickering firelight, nomads who might not have seen each other for a dozen moons shared stories of the herds and the changing seasons. They traded pieces of obsidian, a volcanic glass as black as the night sky and sharper than any razor, which had been carried hundreds of miles from the mountains to the north. They exchanged nodules of high-quality flint and perhaps even more precious things, marriage partners, songs, and secret techniques for tanning hides or fletching arrows. Göbekli Tepe became a crucible of human culture, a place where ideas from different landscapes collided and fused into something new. The motifs we see on the pillars, the foxes, the scorpions, and the strange headless men were likely part of a shared symbolic language that allowed people from distant territories to understand one another's place in the cosmos. We often think of the transition to civilization as a slow, accidental process, but here, in the shadow of the great T-shaped pillars, it feels intentional. The mobilization of such a large labor force over several generations suggests a powerful, unifying belief system that transcended the needs of the individual. It was a shift in the human psyche, a realization that by working together they could create something that would outlast their own brief lives. They were learning the art of the large-scale project, the logistics of cooperation that would eventually lead to the building of cities and the irrigation of the plains. But for now, they remained children of the wild, their feet still accustomed to the uneven earth, their ears tuned to the sounds of the forest. They were standing on a threshold, a bridge between the old world of the wandering band and the new world of the settled society, unaware that the very rituals they performed to honor the spirits of the past were laying the foundation for a future they could scarcely imagine. The silence that now hangs over the site is heavy with the weight of these forgotten conversations. We can look at the stratigraphy, the layers of earth and stone that tell the chronological story of the site, and see how the intensity of the gatherings ebbed and flowed over the centuries. Radiocarbon dating tells us that this activity persisted for over 1,000 years, a span of time longer than the entire history of many modern nations. Through the cold lens of science, we see the bones and the stones, but in the quiet of the twilight, it is easier to feel the presence of the people. We can imagine the low murmur of voices in a dozen different dialects, the rhythmic chipping of flint against limestone, and the deep, resonant thrum of a drum echoing from within the finished circles. They came from the edges of the world to this high ridge, bringing their fears and their wonders, and in doing so they discovered that they were part of something much larger than themselves. In this landscape of deep time, the concept of the tribe begins to blur. Were they separate groups, or were they all branches of a single sprawling culture that saw this mountain as its heart? The evidence of obsidian from the distant peaks of Bingöl and Nemrut Dağ suggests a trade network that spanned hundreds of miles, a web of connection that turned the vast wilderness into a neighborhood. As they gathered, they were not just building temples, they were building a collective memory. They were creating a place where the stories of the stars and the spirits of the animals could be anchored in stone, a permanent archive for a people who had no writing. Every pillar was a page, every enclosure a chapter, and the gathering of the tribes was the act of reading that story together, ensuring that the wisdom of the elders would not be lost when they vanished back into the hills. The mystery remains as to how they managed the logistics of such a crowd without the structures of a formal state. There were no granaries here, no storehouses of wheat or barley to rely on. They were entirely dependent on the natural rhythms of the migration of gazelles and the ripening of wild grasses. It was a fragile balance, a high-stakes gamble played out against the backdrop of a changing climate. And yet they succeeded for millennium after millennium. The social glue of the feast and the spiritual magnet of the temple were stronger than the hardships of the trail. As the years passed, the gatherings likely became more than just a religious duty. They became a necessity for survival, a way to ensure that the knowledge of the wider world was shared and preserved. The ridge was a lighthouse in a dark and uncertain age, a place where the fire of human consciousness was tended with care, long before the first walls of Uruk or Babylon were ever raised. As we linger in this thought, we can almost hear the soft shuffle of many feet on the limestone floor, the rustle of furs and the clinking of stone ornaments. The air is cool, and the stars above are the same stars they watched, though their positions have shifted slightly in the long dance of the eons. We are separated from them by 12,000 years of history, by the rise and fall of empires, the invention of the wheel, and the birth of the digital age. Yet the basic human need to gather, to share, and to build something meaningful remains unchanged. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are silent witnesses to that first great impulse, the moment when we stopped merely inhabiting the world and began, slowly and with great effort, to shape it in the image of our dreams. The tribes would eventually depart, drifting back into the golden grasses of the steppe, but they carried the memory of the mountain with them, a spark of organization and a sense of shared identity that would smolder for centuries before finally bursting into the flame of civilization. Imagine a time when the night was not merely a backdrop for dreams, but a living, breathing map of the divine. Long before the first cities rose from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates, the people of the Anatolian plateau, looked upward into a darkness so profound it felt like a physical weight. To those early hunter-gatherers, the stars were not distant balls of burning gas, but the campfires of ancestors, the eyes of celestial predators, and the ticking gears of a cosmic clock they were only just beginning to read. As they gathered within the limestone circles of Göbekli Tepe, their eyes naturally followed the towering T-shaped pillars toward the zenith, where the velvet blackness of the sky met the cold, sharp edges of the stone. There is a growing body of thought among those who study these ancient ruins that the enclosures were never meant to be viewed in isolation from the heavens. Some researchers suggest that the very orientation of the structures, the way the central pillars lean or the direction the enclosures open, was dictated by the movements of the stars. One compelling theory focuses on Sirius, the dog star, the brightest light in the night sky. Because of the Earth's slow wobble on its axis, a phenomenon known as precession, the position of stars changes over thousands of years. 12,000 years ago, Sirius would have been a new and rising power in the southern sky, appearing for the first time in centuries. It is possible that these stone circles were built as monumental sightings designed to track the rebirth of this brilliant star as it ascended from the horizon, a celestial beacon guiding the tribes toward a new understanding of time. Others look toward the constellation of Orion, the hunter, whose belt and sword have dominated the human imagination for eons. In a world where survival depended on the hunt, the alignment of these massive stones with the belt of Orion would have turned the temple into a mirror of the sky, a place where the earthly hunter met his celestial counterpart in a sacred union of stone and starlight. We must wonder if the pillars themselves were meant to be more than just supports or symbols. Perhaps they were antennas, reaching upward to catch the influence of the heavens and pull it down into the earth. This connection between the soil and the stars suggests that for the people of the pre-pottery Neolithic, the concept of sacred space was inseparable from the concept of time. The sky was their first scripture. By aligning their stones with the stars, they were anchoring their lives to something eternal, something that did not wither like the grass or die like the buffalo. As you step into the imagined center of an enclosure, the atmosphere shifts. The air here feels different, cooler perhaps, or perhaps just heavier with the weight of expectation. Within these circular walls, the outside world falls away. The wind that whips across the dusty plateau is silenced by the thick limestone blocks, replaced by a strange resonant stillness. Archaeologists and acoustic engineers have noted that the shape of these enclosures creates a particular sonic environment. A low chant, a rhythmic drumbeat, or even the steady breathing of a group of people would have echoed and amplified, vibrating against the carved reliefs of foxes, vultures, and scorpions. In the flickering light of a small fire or a torch made of resinous wood, the animals carved into the pillars would have seemed to twitch and move. The shadows would stretch and contract, giving the stone a life of its own. During the transitions of the seasons, the summer and winter solstices, the light would enter the enclosures at specific angles, illuminating certain carvings while leaving others in total darkness. One can imagine a priest or a shaman standing in a shaft of light that only appears once a year, his voice carrying through the stone chamber with an unnatural clarity, speaking to the ancestors who lived among the stars. This brings us to the profound idea of the axis mundi, the center of the world. In many ancient cultures, there is a belief in a central point where the heavens, the earth, and the underworld meet. It is the umbilical cord of the universe, the pivot around which all of existence turns. For the hunter-gatherers who converged on this limestone ridge, Göbekli Tepe was that center. It was the mountain at the heart of the world. By carving their stories into the rock and aligning those rocks with the movements of the cosmos, they were creating a fixed point in a shifting, dangerous landscape. The pillars do not just stand, they reach. They are the giants that hold up the sky, preventing the heavens from collapsing onto the earth. When a person stood between the two central pillars of Enclosure D, They were standing at the crossroads of the seen and the unseen. They were suspended between the deep, dark earth from which the limestone was quarried and the infinite, sparkling heights of the celestial sphere. It is easy to imagine the silence of a winter night 12 millennia ago. The fire has burned down to embers, casting a soft orange glow on the belly of a stone lion. The stars above are so bright they seem to hum. The people gathered here are not yet farmers. They do not yet know the heavy burden of the plough or the boundaries of the field. But they know the sky. They know that when a certain star touches the tip of a certain pillar, it is time to remember the dead. They know that the stone is a bridge. As the centuries drifted by, the stars continued their slow processional dance, drifting away from the alignments the builders had so carefully calculated. Perhaps this is why new enclosures were built, and old ones were eventually buried. The world was changing, the sky was shifting, and the people had to keep pace with the gods. But the impulse remained the same, to find a place where the chaos of nature could be ordered, where the terrifying vastness of the universe could be brought down to a human scale. The mystery of these alignments reminds us that our ancestors were not primitive in their thinking, even if their tools were made of flint and bone. Their intellectual lives were as complex as our own, filled with a deep yearning to understand their place in the grand design. They looked at the same moon we see tonight, and they felt the same shiver of awe at the sight of the Milky Way spilling across the dark. In the quiet of these enclosures, time seems to loop back on itself. The gap between the modern observer and the ancient builder narrows, bridged by the shared experience of looking upward in wonder. We are still, in many ways, those same people, seeking a center, seeking a sign from the silence of the stars. The stones of Göbekli Tepe remain as a testament to that first, great attempt to map the soul onto the stars, creating a sacred geography that still resonates, however faintly, in the quiet corners of our own modern minds. As the night deepens and the world grows still, we can almost hear the faint echo of their songs, carried on the wind that still blows across the ancient dusty ridge, whispering of a time when the earth and the sky were one. Consider for a moment the fine, persistent layer of dust that settles upon a shelf when a room is left undisturbed for a month or a year. To the archaeologist, this dust is a clock, a slow accumulation of time that usually marks the gradual abandonment of a place as it is reclaimed by the wind and the rain. But at Göbekli Tepe, the layers of earth tell a different, more unsettling story, one that defies the natural order of decay. As the centuries turned into millennia on that limestone ridge, the people did not simply walk away and leave their great stone circles to the elements. Instead, they did something that seems almost unthinkable to our modern minds, which seek to preserve every monument for eternity. They chose to bury them. They gathered vast quantities of limestone rubble, flint chips, and the bones of animals they had hunted, and they poured this debris into the enclosures until the great T-shaped pillars were completely submerged, hidden away from the light of the sun and the gaze of the living. It was not a sudden catastrophe or a slow process of silting, but a deliberate, massive undertaking, an act of ritual concealment that turned a temple into a tomb. This process of backfilling is perhaps the greatest mystery of the site, for it suggests that the life of a temple was not meant to be infinite. In the quiet logic of this lost civilization, a sacred space perhaps possessed a lifespan, much like a human being. It was born through the labor of hundreds. It lived through the performance of rituals and the observation of the stars, and eventually it reached the end of its spiritual utility. To bury the enclosure was to perform a decommissioning, a way of laying the temple to rest, ensuring that the power it had harnessed remained safely contained within the earth. As we stand atop the mound today, we are walking upon a landscape of intentional forgetting, where each layer of soil represents a final goodbye to a world that was once vibrant with song and firelight. The material used to fill these spaces is equally haunting when examined closely. Mixed among the stones and the dirt are thousands upon thousands of animal bones, gazelle, wild cattle and boar, the remnants of gargantuan feasts that must have lasted for days. But more chillingly, researchers have discovered fragments of human bones scattered within the fill, most notably pieces of human skulls. These are not complete burials, but rather fragments that bear distinct marks, deep, intentional grooves carved into the bone with flint tools. It appears that the skull was a focus of intense veneration, perhaps stripped of its flesh and hung within the temple, or displayed as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. In the stillness of the laboratory, where these fragments are studied under soft light, the evidence points toward a complex skull cult that predates the established religions of the Near East by thousands of years. The presence of these bones within the backfill suggests that when the temple was buried, the ancestors were buried with it. It was a final, collective interment, a way of anchoring the spirits of the dead to the site forever. We might imagine the final days of an enclosure, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and the rhythmic thud of earth being moved as the community worked in unison to erase their own creation from the horizon. There is a profound patience in this act of burial. By filling the enclosures, these ancient people created a time capsule, though they could never have imagined the world that would eventually break the seal. The backfilling protected the delicate carvings from the harsh erosion of the Anatolian winters and the scouring desert winds, preserving the crisp edges of the stone foxes and the intricate textures of the scorpions for 12,000 years. It is as if they were tucking the site into a long, deep sleep, placing it in a state of suspended animation that would last through the rise and fall of every empire history has ever known. As the years passed and the original builders faded into the mists of the deep past, the mound grew taller with each successive burial of a temple. The stratigraphy, that is, the study of these layered deposits, shows a transition from the massive circular enclosures of the oldest period to smaller rectangular rooms built on top of the fill. The grand vision of the first architects began to shrink, or perhaps it merely changed its shape as the needs of the people shifted, but the act of burying the past remained a constant. The ridge became a necropolis of ideas, a place where the old ways were literally the foundation for the new, even as the memory of why the first stones were raised began to dim. We must wonder what it felt like to cast the last basket of earth over the head of a great stone pillar, watching the carved eyes of a stone predator disappear beneath the soil. Was it an act of grief, or a celebration of a cycle completed? In our modern era, we struggle to let go of anything. We build museums to hold back the tide of time. But at Göbekli Tepe, the ancient ones understood that there is a season for all things to remain under the sky, and a season for them to return to the dark embrace of the earth. The transition from an active, bustling center of ritual to a silent, buried mound marks a pivotal moment in the human story. It reflects a time when our relationship with the permanent was different than it is today. To them, the power was perhaps not in the stone itself, but in the act of building it, and subsequently in the act of letting it go. As the wind whispers over the parched grass of the Potbelly hill, we are reminded that we are only the latest visitors to a place that has spent the vast majority of its existence in total darkness, a buried world, waiting for a future that its creators could never have envisioned. The mystery of the backfill invites us to contemplate the nature of endings. Every civilization leaves behind a footprint, but few have so carefully cleaned their tracks. By burying their temples, the people of the early Neolithic ensured that their most sacred secrets would remain theirs alone, hidden away from the prying eyes of the centuries. And so, the great stone circles remained in their earthen cocoons, protected by the very debris that sought to hide them as the world outside changed beyond all recognition. As forests retreated, as the first seeds were planted in the valleys below, and as the stars they once tracked shifted their positions in the infinite velvet of the night, the silence of the hills is rarely total, for the wind carries the memory of 1,000 generations across the limestone plateaus of southeastern Turkey. While the discovery of Göbekli Tepe shattered our understanding of the timeline of human civilization, it was merely the first whisper of a much larger, much older story. As archaeologists expanded their gaze across the parched horizon, they began to realize that the great temple was not a solitary island of stone in a sea of hunter-gatherers. It was the crown jewel of a vast, interconnected landscape that we now call the Tas Tepele, or the Stone Hills. This project, a massive undertaking of modern research, has revealed that the entire Harran Plain was once dotted with these ritual centers, forming a constellation of sacred sites that functioned as a singular, breathing network of spiritual life 12,000 years ago. Among these sister sites, none is more haunting or enigmatic than Karahan Tepe. Located just 30 miles to the east of its more famous cousin, Karahan Tepe sits like a silent sentinel atop a rugged ridge, its stones carved directly from the living bedrock. When you walk among these ruins, you feel the weight of deep time pressing against your skin, a sense that the ground beneath your feet has been saturated with the intentions of a people who lived before the invention of the wheel, before the first clay pot was fired, and long before the first word was ever written. Here, the architecture feels even more intimate, perhaps even more visceral, than the grand circles of the first temple. The most striking feature of Karahan Tepe is a chamber that defies easy explanation, a rectangular room carved with such precision that it seems to have grown out of the earth itself. Inside this space, the ancient builders carved 11 upright pillars, but these are not the abstract T-shaped monoliths we see elsewhere. These pillars are phallic in shape, rising from the floor like stone fingers reaching toward the sky. At the end of this row of pillars, a human head emerges from the wall, a stoic, weathered face with large, staring eyes and a prominent nose, carved with a quiet intensity that bridges the gap of 12 millennia. This figure gazes eternally across the chamber, overseeing whatever rituals took place within this subterranean womb. It is a place of shadows and symbolism, where the boundaries between the human form and the natural world are blurred into insignificance. Some researchers suggest that this room was designed for a rite of passage, a place where a person would enter through one narrow channel, navigate the forest of stone pillars, and emerge from another opening as someone entirely different. Perhaps it was a symbolic rebirth, a transition from youth to adulthood, or from the mundane world into the realm of the sacred. The precision of the carving suggests that every shadow cast by the sun, every angle of the stone was calculated with a sophisticated understanding of geometry and light. As we look across the wider landscape of the Tas Tepele, the scale of this civilization begins to emerge from the dust. We find sites like Habetsuvan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and Sayburç, each echoing the themes of the others, yet each possessing its own unique character. This was not a collection of isolated tribes wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. This was a coordinated regional culture that shared a complex system of beliefs, symbols, and architectural techniques. They were moving massive stones, some weighing several tons, across miles of uneven terrain, an effort that would have required hundreds of people working in harmony, fueled by a shared vision that surpassed the simple need for survival. The sheer density of these sites suggests that the Harran Plain was a vibrant hub of activity during the pre-pottery Neolithic, a term archaeologists use to describe this specific window of time after the last ice age but before the widespread use of ceramics. It was an era of transition, a slow-motion revolution where the old ways of the hunter-gatherer were beginning to merge with the new possibilities of settled life. Yet these sites were not villages in the way we understand them today. There are no clear signs of permanent domestic houses at the earliest levels, no kitchens, no trash heaps of daily life. Instead, they appear to be purely ceremonial, a network of ritual destinations where people would gather from far and wide at specific times of the year, perhaps guided by the cycles of the moon or the migration of the gazelle herds. Imagine the landscape 12,000 years ago, a lush green savanna teeming with life, where the sound of stone hammers striking limestone echoed across the valleys. Groups of people would travel for days, following the familiar contours of the hills, drawn toward the silhouettes of the stone circles on the horizon. They would bring with them stories, songs, and perhaps offerings of flint or obsidian. These gatherings were the glue that held their world together, a way to share knowledge, to forge alliances, and to find meaning in a world that was often harsh and unpredictable. The Tas Tepele was a landscape of the mind as much as it was a landscape of stone, a sacred geography that mapped the relationship between humanity, the animals they hunted, and the mysteries of the cosmos. The mystery deepens when we consider the technical skill required to create these sites. The builders used radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic materials, to confirm that these structures are indeed over 11,000 years old. This places them firmly at the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden, intense cooling that gripped the earth for over 1,000 years. It is a profound contradiction that during a time of environmental stress and scarcity, humanity reached a pinnacle of artistic and architectural achievement. Perhaps it was the very challenge of the changing climate that drove them to create these monuments, a way to plead with the gods for the return of the warmth, or a way to anchor themselves in an increasingly unstable world. As the years pass and the excavations continue, the dirt of the Harran Plain slowly gives up its secrets, one layer of stratigraphy at a time. Stratigraphy is the study of the layers of earth and rock, where the deeper levels represent older moments in history, a vertical timeline of human existence. At Karahan Tepe, the layers tell a story of long-term occupation and deliberate closure. Like Göbekli Tepe, these structures were eventually filled in, buried by the very people who built them. This act of burial was not a gesture of abandonment, but one of preservation, a final ritual that marked the end of a site's life cycle. They were returning the sacred stones to the earth, tucking them away into a long, dreamless sleep that would last for 10,000 years. The network of the Tas Tepele challenges our most basic assumptions about the origins of organized society. We have long been taught that agriculture was the foundation of civilization, that once we learned to farm, we had the surplus food and the free time to build temples and develop complex religions. But the evidence from these hills suggests the opposite. It seems that the temple came first. The need to gather, to worship, and to build something eternal is what drove people to settle down, and eventually to experiment with the wild grasses that would become our modern wheat. The spirit preceded the stomach. The dream of the stone circles was the catalyst that changed our species forever. As the narrator of this story, I find myself wondering about the individual hands that carved the phallic pillars of Karahan Tepe, the calloused palms, the tired shoulders, the eyes that looked up at the same stars we see tonight. They lived in a world that was intimately connected to the rhythms of nature, a world where every rock and every stream was alive with meaning. To them, the Tas Tepele was not a collection of archaeological sites. It was the center of the universe. It was the place where the veil between the worlds was thinnest, where the ancestors spoke through the wind, and where the stones themselves held the power to shape the future. And so, we stand on the edge of a great revelation, looking out over the silent hills of Turkey, realizing that we are only just beginning to understand the depth of our own history. The stone circles remain, half buried in the dust, waiting for us to listen to what they have to say. They remind us that we are part of a very old, very long journey, a journey that began in the shadows of these limestone ridges, under a sky that was once crowded with gods. As we move deeper into the mysteries of the first temple and its sister sites, we find ourselves not just looking at the past, but looking into a mirror, seeing the first flickers of the human spirit as it reached out to touch the infinite. In the quiet soil of the Karahan Mountains, a few miles from the rising monoliths, there grows a humble grass that holds the secret of our world. To a casual observer, it looks like any other wild grain, swaying gently in the dry Anatolian breeze. Yet this is the ancestor. Geneticists, peering through the lens of modern science, have traced the DNA of our modern-bred wheat back to this very hillside, back to the wild einkorn that still clings to the slopes of these volcanic peaks. It is a living artifact, a biological bridge spanning 12,000 years. For a long time, we believed that the plough came before the temple. The old story told us that humans first learned to farm, and once they had full bellies and granaries, they built grand monuments to their gods. But the dust of Göbekli Tepe suggests a different rhythm, a more mysterious sequence of events. It hints that it was the hunger of the spirit that drove the hunger of the body. As hundreds, perhaps thousands of people gathered to carve these massive stones and haul them across the plateau, they needed to be fed. The old ways of wandering, of picking berries and following the gazelle, were no longer enough to sustain the sheer scale of the dream they were building. The first seeds were not planted for profit or safety, but perhaps to ensure that the work on the sacred circles could continue, that the stone giants could be finished. This transition was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, rhythmic pulse that lasted for generations. We must imagine a time when the line between the wild and the domestic was as thin as a morning mist. People were not yet farmers in the way we understand the word. They were participants in the landscape. They began to linger longer in the valleys surrounding the ritual sites. They noticed that where seeds fell, life returned. They began to protect these patches of green, weeding out the thorns, watching the sky for rain with a new kind of intensity. As the years passed, the grain changed, and so did the people. The wild einkorn, which naturally shatters and scatters its seeds to the wind, began to hold on to its bounty, waiting for the human hand to harvest it. It was a silent pact made in the shadows of the limestone pillars, a quiet agreement between the earth and the architects of the infinite. As the first permanent villages began to take shape, a profound shift occurred in the human psyche, a change so deep that we are still feeling its echoes today. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived as part of the weave of nature. They were guests in the forest, moving with the seasons, taking only what was offered. But as they settled near the temples, as they began to clear the land and pen the wild sheep, they stepped outside the circle. They were no longer just observers. They were masters. The world was no longer something to be followed, but something to be shaped, ordered, and controlled. This was the birth of a new kind of loneliness, perhaps, but also a new kind of power. The walls of the first houses did more than keep out the cold. They created a boundary between the human realm and the wild unknown. Inside the village, there was the hearth, the family, and the harvested grain. Outside, there was the vast, untamed dark. The temple stood at the threshold of these two worlds, a mediator between the domestic and the divine. We can almost feel the weight of this change in the stones themselves, in the way the carvings of fierce predators, lions, spiders, and snakes, are rendered with such terrifying precision. It is as if the builders were trying to capture the wild spirit of the world and pin it down in stone, keeping it at bay while they carved out a new way of living. And so, the hunter-gatherer faded into the shadows of history, and the settler emerged into the light of the new sun. The transition from foraging to farming was not just a change in diet. It was a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be alive. It was the moment we began to settle into the earth, to root ourselves in one place, and to look up at the stars not as wanderers, but as guardians of the land. The stones of Göbekli Tepe watched this transformation in silence. They saw the first fires that never went out, the first paths that turned into roads, and the first children who grew up knowing only the village and the field. As we contemplate these ancient foundations, we realize that we are looking at the very cradle of our modern existence. Every city we build, every field we harvest, and every wall we raise is a continuation of the work started here on this high ridge in Turkey. The mystery of the first temple is not just about who built it or how. It is about why we chose to stop wandering and start building. It is about the moment we decided to make a permanent home in a world that is always moving. In the stillness of the ruins, under the vast and ancient sky, we can almost hear the heartbeat of that first settlement, a slow, steady rhythm that has been beating for 12,000 years, reminding us that we are the children of the stone and the grain. The silence of the stones often invites the most restless of human imaginations to fill the void. When we gaze upon the massive T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe, rising like giants from the dusty earth of the Germush Mountains, there is a natural instinct to search for a familiar hand in the darkness, a desire to find a lost master architect who brought the light of civilization to a primitive world. We find ourselves wandering into the shadows of myths, wondering if these stones were placed by the survivors of a sunken continent, or perhaps by visitors from the stars who looked down upon the cradle of humanity with an alien curiosity. These theories carry a certain romantic weight, a sense of wonder that satisfies our love for the grand and the inexplicable. Yet as we lean closer to the cold surface of the limestone, the story etched into the rock is perhaps even more profound because it is so deeply, undeniably human. The mystery of the first temple does not require us to look toward the heavens or toward lost empires beneath the sea. Instead, it asks us to look at the slow, patient hands of the people who already called this land their home. There is a common misconception that the hunter-gatherers of the early Holocene were incapable of such monumental feats, that they were merely wandering shadows, living hand-to-mouth without the complexity needed to organize a workforce or envision a sacred space. But the archaeology tells a different story, one revealed through the meticulous study of stratigraphy, the layers of time piled one on top of the other like the pages of a forgotten book. When we examine the chips of flint and the discarded bones found within the fill of the enclosures, we see no evidence of a sudden, external influence. There are no tools from a distant land, no technologies that defy the capabilities of the local culture. What we see is the evolution of a people who had been observing the world for thousands of years, who knew the grain of the stone and the movement of the herds as intimately as they knew their own breath. We often struggle to grasp the concept of deep time, the way 1,000 years can pass in a single breath of history. It is easy to imagine that civilization was a spark, a sudden gift from a higher intelligence, because the alternative is much harder to fathom. That it was a slow, agonizingly gradual process of trial and error. This is the beauty of what archaeologists call slow history. It is the realization that the knowledge required to carve a 20-ton pillar did not arrive overnight. It was built upon generations of smaller carvings, of understanding how to use fire and water to split the rock, of learning how to move heavy weights using nothing but ropes, wooden rollers, and the collective strength of 100 shoulders. When we attribute these feats to extraterrestrials or lost high-technology civilizations, we inadvertently strip away the true achievement of our ancestors. We deny them their struggle, their ingenuity, and the sheer persistence it took to transform a mountain into a sanctuary. As the years passed and the excavations deepened, the science of radiocarbon dating, measuring the slow decay of carbon isotopes within organic remains, confirmed that these structures were built over a period of many centuries. This was not a single project led by a lone visionary, but a continuous conversation between the people and the land. There is a danger, too, in projecting our modern religious concepts onto the Neolithic mind. We see a temple and we think of priests, dogmas, and the organized structures of the modern world. We look for a singular god or a defined pantheon, assuming that the people of 12,000 years ago thought as we do. But the reality was likely far more fluid, far more connected to the immediate spirits of the animals and the ancestors. The pillars are not just statues, they are presences. They represent a world where the boundary between the human, the animal, and the divine was as thin as a veil of mist in the morning. The myth of the lost civilization often stems from a misunderstanding of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt cooling that gripped the earth roughly 12,900 years ago. Some suggest that this climatic shift was the result of a cataclysm that wiped out an advanced global society, leaving only the ruins of places like Göbekli Tepe as a memory. While the environmental change was indeed real and challenging, the archaeological record shows a story of resilience rather than total collapse. The local groups did not vanish. They adapted. They gathered in larger numbers, perhaps seeking solace and strength in the communal labor of building the stone circles. The stones were not a legacy of a dying world, but a foundation for a new one. They were a response to the cold and the uncertainty, a way to anchor the soul to a specific point on the map when everything else was shifting. In the stillness of the site, it becomes clear that the greatest mystery is not who gave these people the knowledge, but how they found the will to cooperate on such a massive scale without the hierarchies we take for granted today. There are no palaces here, no signs of kings or masters who lived in luxury while others toiled. The evidence suggests a society of equals brought together by a shared vision or a shared need to touch the infinite. This indigenous development is far more miraculous than any story of ancient astronauts. It tells us that the capacity for greatness, for art, and for complex social organization is woven into the very fabric of our species. It was there in the hands that chipped at the limestone 14,000 years ago, and it remains there in the quiet moments of our own lives. As we move through the ruins, we must be careful not to let our modern desires for a tidy narrative obscure the messy, beautiful reality of the past. The stone circles do not offer easy answers. They do not tell us the names of their builders or the prayers they whispered to the wind. Instead, they offer us a mirror, a chance to see ourselves in the long, slow march of time. We see a people who are not so different from us, standing at the edge of a changing world, trying to make sense of the stars and the seasons. The lost part of this civilization is not their technology or their origins, but the specific stories they told themselves to keep the darkness at bay. Those stories have dissolved into the soil, leaving only the silent stone sentinels to watch over the plateau. Meanwhile, the work of the archaeologists continues, moving at a pace that respects the age of the site. They brush away the dust of millennia, one grain at a time, resisting the urge to jump to grand conclusions. They understand that the truth is found in the small things, in the way a stone was flaked, in the species of wild grasses found in the hearths, and in the subtle patterns of the landscape. This patient observation reveals a history that is much more intricate than any myth. It is a history of local innovation, of cultural exchange between neighboring groups, and of a deep spiritual connection to the Anatolian plains. The stone circles were not imported from a distant land. They grew out of the very earth they stand upon, nourished by the sweat and the dreams of the people who walked these hills. So we sit with the mystery, letting the theories of the past drift away like smoke from an ancient fire. We accept that there are things we may never know, and in that acceptance we find a deeper kind of peace. The stones do not need to be the work of gods or ghosts to be holy. They are holy because they are the first tentative steps of a journey that is still ongoing, a journey toward understanding our place in the cosmos. The weight of the forgotten ages is not a burden, but a foundation. It reminds us that we are part of a long, unbroken chain of human experience, stretching back through the mists of the younger Dryas to the very first time a human hand carved a shape into a rock and felt the spark of creation. In the quiet of the night, under the same stars that watched over those first builders, we can feel the pulse of that ancient world, a slow, steady rhythm that tells us we are home. The discovery of these limestone monoliths did more than just unearth a collection of buried pillars. It shattered the very timeline we had carefully constructed for our own species. For a long time, we believed that the cradle of civilization was built upon a foundation of wheat and barley, that the hard labor of farming came first, and only once the granaries were full did we find the leisure time to invent gods and build them houses. But Göbekli Tepe stands as a silent, stony contradiction to that story. It suggests that the dream came before the bread, that the hunger for the sacred was more urgent than the hunger for food. By pushing the origins of monumental architecture back 6,000 years before the Great Pyramids, these circles have forced us to look at our hunter-gatherer ancestors not as primitive wanderers, but as masters of geometry, engineering, and social organization. As we trace the lineage of these stones, we see the echoes of their design rippling forward through the millennia. The transition from the circular, womb-like enclosures of the pre-pottery Neolithic into the more rigid, rectangular forms of the later Bronze Age represents a profound shift in the human psyche. We see the soft curves of the early hills give way to the sharp corners of administrative centers and urban temples. The open-air sanctuaries, where the wind could whistle through the pillars and the stars remained visible, eventually became enclosed, darkened inner sanctums. The hidden hearts of Mesopotamian ziggurats and Egyptian mortuary temples. Yet, if one looks closely at the grandest cathedrals of the Middle Ages or the towering ruins of the Levant, the DNA of Göbekli Tepe is still there, in the way we use verticality to bridge the gap between the earth and the heavens, and in the way we arrange stone to create a boundary between the mundane world and the eternal. The impulse that drove those ancient people to drag 7-ton blocks of limestone across a dusty plateau remains the same impulse that guides us today. It is the enduring human need to mark our place in the universe, to create a space that feels separate from the wild, chaotic flow of nature. In the quiet of the Turkish highlands, one can almost feel the weight of this legacy. It is the legacy of the first question ever asked of the sky. The legacy of the first time a group of strangers became a community through the shared labor of a sacred task. This site, now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Treasure, is no longer just a pile of rocks in a remote corner of the world. It is a mirror. When we look into the deep, carved eyes of the stone foxes and vultures, we are looking at the very first stirrings of the modern mind. There is a certain comfort in knowing that despite the rise and fall of countless empires, the core of who we are has changed so very little. We still gather in large groups to seek meaning. We still use art to process our fears of the natural world, and we still find ourselves awestruck by the sheer scale of the passage of time. The site sits as a guardian of our collective memory, preserved by the very soil that was used to bury it 12,000 years ago. It waited in the dark for over 100 centuries, holding its breath until we were ready to find it again and rediscover a part of ourselves we didn't even know we had lost. As the years continue to pass and more of the mounds are carefully excavated, the mystery only seems to deepen. Each new enclosure found beneath the earth adds another layer to a story that is still being written. A story of how we became the builders of worlds. We are left to wonder how many other such places lie sleeping beneath the sands of time, waiting for a shovel or a change in the wind to bring them back into the light. The legacy of the stone circles is not just in the past. It is a living presence, a reminder that our history is far older, far stranger, and far more beautiful than we ever dared to imagine. The weight of the earth is a patient guardian, holding its breath for 10 millennia, while the world above transformed from a wilderness of flint and fir into a landscape of steel and glass. To protect what has been reclaimed from this long slumber, a modern canopy now stretches over the main excavation area, a vast, elegant membrane that floats like a white cloud against the harsh Turkish sky. It serves as a shield against the blistering sun and the occasional lashing rain, ensuring that the soft limestone pillars, so meticulously carved by hands that have been dust for 12,000 years, do not crumble under the touch of the modern elements. This structure is a silent promise to the past, a commitment that having finally found these stones, we will not let them vanish again. Beneath this protective shell, the work continues with a stillness that mirrors the site itself. The German Archaeological Institute, which has spearheaded the research here since the middle of the 1990s, operates with a profound sense of stewardship. Their method is one of slow, deliberate precision, a conversation with the soil that proceeds millimetre by millimetre. They understand that archaeology is by its very nature a destructive science. To dig is to remove the context of the earth forever. And so they move with the grace of surgeons, documenting every shard of flint and every fragment of bone, aware that each grain of dust holds a piece of a puzzle that spans the entirety of human history. There is no rush here, for time at Göbekli Tepe is measured not in hours or days, but in the slow accumulation of millennia. It is a humbling realization to stand at the edge of the excavated pits and understand that we have only scratched the surface of this megalithic mystery. Experts estimate that a staggering 95% of the site still remains underground, nestled within the belly of the artificial hill. Ground-penetrating radar has whispered of at least 20 more circular enclosures still waiting in the dark, dozens of pillars that have not seen the sun since the end of the last ice age. We are looking through a keyhole at a vast subterranean cathedral, seeing only the smallest fraction of what the ancients built. The hillsides are thick with secrets, and for every question we answer, the earth offers 10 more mysteries in return. We wonder what lies in those unreached depths, perhaps older pillars, or different animals, or perhaps the answers to why this great temple was finally, and so carefully, put to sleep. As the afternoon light begins to soften, shifting from a brilliant gold to a deep, bruised purple, the ridge of the Potbelly hill takes on a different character. The wind, which carries the scent of dry grass and ancient dust, seems to hum through the gaps in the stones. To stand here at the close of the day is to feel the thinness of the veil between our world and theirs. The modern world falls away. The distant hum of engines and the glow of nearby cities seem like fleeting illusions compared to the permanence of the limestone. The shadows of the T-shaped pillars grow long and thin, stretching across the floors of the enclosures like the fingers of a sundial that has been ticking for 120 centuries. The silence that settles over the ridge is not empty. It is a heavy, resonant quiet, filled with the presence of the thousands of people who once gathered here to feast, to mourn,
and to look up at a sky that was different from our own. They saw stars that have since shifted their positions in the heavens, and they felt a connection to the cosmos that we are only just beginning to rediscover. As the sun dips below the horizon, bathing the landscape in a final fiery glow, the pillars seem to lean into the darkness, standing as tall and resolute as they did when the first seeds of civilization were just beginning to stir in the fertile soil of the valley below. We are merely the latest visitors to a place that has seen the rise and fall of everything we know. The preservation of this silence is perhaps our greatest duty to the site. While the researchers continue their patient mapping of the underground anomalies, there is a growing sense that some things are meant to remain hidden, at least for a while longer. The 95% that remains buried is a gift to future generations, a library of stones that will be read by eyes more advanced than ours, using tools we cannot yet imagine. For now, the canopy stands watch, and the German Archaeological Institute continues its vigil, ensuring that the transition from the deep past to the uncertain future is handled with the reverence it deserves. The stone circles are no longer lost, but they remain profoundly mysterious, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to reach for the divine even in the coldest reaches of time. The scent of rain on parched limestone is a smell that has not changed in 12,000 years. It is a sharp mineral tang that rises from the belly of the earth whenever the clouds finally break over the Anatolian plateau. When those first heavy drops hit the T-shaped pillars today, they release the same ancient aroma that would have greeted the hunter-gatherers as they labored in the dust of the pre-pottery Neolithic. We often imagine the past as a foreign country, a place separated from us by an unbridgeable chasm of time, yet in these small sensory moments the distance vanishes. The cold stone under a palm, the grit of sand in the wind, the low hum of a distant storm, these are the threads that sew our world to theirs. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a great forgetting. To look upon the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe is to realize that our understanding of human progress has long been a story of missing chapters. We once believed that civilization was a slow, steady climb, a ladder where each rung was neatly labeled with the invention of farming, then pottery, then writing. But the pillars tell a different story. They suggest that the climb was more like a series of waves, rising and falling in a vast, dark ocean. Long before the first brick was laid in Sumer, long before the first stone was carved in Egypt, a group of people whose names are lost to the wind gathered on this ridge to do something extraordinary. They did not build for shelter, and they did not build for survival. They built for the sake of a dream, an idea that transcended the simple need to eat and sleep. As we reflect on these builders, we must confront the humbling reality of their sophistication. They were not primitive in the way we often use the word. Their brains were identical to ours, their capacity for wonder just as deep, their hands just as skilled at coaxing meaning from the raw material of the world. Using only stone tools, they carved three-dimensional lions that seem to leap from the rock and delicate foxes that skip across the limestone surfaces. They understood the mathematics of symmetry and the logistics of moving stones that weighed many tons. And yet, after centuries of devotion, they chose to walk away. They filled their temples with dirt and rubble, backfilling the enclosures with a deliberate, rhythmic precision that suggests a final, solemn ritual. It is as if they were tucking their gods into bed, hiding their greatest achievements from the eyes of the future, or perhaps protecting them from a change in the world that they could sense coming. There is a profound cyclicality to this landscape. The mountains rise and erode, the grasses turn from vibrant green to brittle gold with the passing of the seasons. Civilizations bloom like desert flowers after a rare rain, only to wither and return to the soil. We live in a frantic age, one defined by the illusion of permanence,
but the ruins on the ridge remind us that we are merely guests in a much longer narrative. The people of the stone circles likely thought their way of life would endure forever, just as we often do. They watched the same moon wax and wane, and they felt the same anxieties about the changing climate as the younger Dryas. That final, bitter cold snap of the last ice age altered the migration patterns of the animals they hunted. They were a people in transition, standing on the knife edge between the old world of the wanderer and the new world of the settler. The mystery of why they stopped remains the most haunting question of all. Was it a shift in belief? A failure of the environment? Or did they simply evolve into something else, leaving their stone sentinels behind as a discarded shell? We may never have the answers, for the deeper we dig into the stratigraphy, the layers of earth that act as a timeline of human occupation, the more we realize that every discovery only uncovers 3 more questions. The site is a library where the pages have been scattered by the wind, and we are left trying to reconstruct the plot from a few beautiful, terrifying illustrations. As the night deepens over the modern excavations, a heavy silence settles into the trenches. The archaeologists have gone to their beds, the tourists have long since departed, and the site is left to the creatures of the dark. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal cries out, a sound that has echoed across these hills since the dawn of time. The wind moves through the protective canopy, making the fabric sigh and groan, a ghostly reminder of the breath that once filled the lungs of the thousands who gathered here. If you were to stand among the pillars now, in the absolute darkness of a moonless night, you would feel the weight of those 12,000 years pressing down. It is not a heavy weight, but a quiet one, a sense of being part of a lineage that stretches back into the mist. The stars above Göbekli Tepe are the same stars the builders mapped with such care, though the earth has wobbled slightly on its axis over the millennia, a process known as precession. The constellations still tell the same stories. Orion still hunts across the southern sky. The Great Bear still circles the pole. The limestone pillars, with their arms carved in relief across their sides, seem to be reaching upward, trying to grasp the light of those distant suns. They are frozen in a gesture of eternal reaching, a testament to the human desire to connect the terrestrial with the celestial. We are, at our core, a species that looks up. We are a species that seeks patterns in the chaos and meaning in the silence. There is a strange comfort in the thought that we are not the first to struggle with the big questions, and we will certainly not be the last. The stone circles were lost to human memory for 10,000 years, buried beneath the dust of the Harran plain, yet they waited patiently for us to find them. They endured the rise and fall of the Bronze Age empires, the march of Roman legions, and the birth of modern industry, all while tucked safely in their earthen womb. Their rediscovery is a gift, a chance to look into a mirror and see a version of ourselves we had completely forgotten. It reminds us that our history is much longer, much richer, and much more mysterious than we ever dared to imagine. And so, we leave the ridge to the shadows. The limestone, cooled by the night air, holds the memory of the sun's heat, just as the ruins hold the memory of the people who shaped them. The wind continues its tireless work, smoothing the edges of the carvings, slowly turning the sharp lines of the foxes and scorpions back into the raw texture of the mountain. In time, perhaps, the earth will reclaim it all once more. But for now, the pillars stand. They watch. They wait. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the vastness of that time. 12,000 years of winters and summers, 12,000 years of starlight. Feel the stillness of the plateau, the cool touch of the breeze, and the rhythmic pulse of a world that is far older than any city, any king, or any book. The story of the first temple is not a story of the past, but a story of the enduring human spirit, a spirit that, even in the coldest reaches of time, reached out into the dark and built something beautiful. The echoes in the dust are not fading,
They are simply waiting for us to listen. Let the image of the limestone ridge fade into the darkness of your mind. Let the sound of the wind be the last thing you hear, a soft, steady breath that carries the secrets of the ancients into the quiet of the night.